It was a cool Thursday morning in late October, the kind of morning that still carried a bite of summer in the sunlight, but hinted at the crisp sharpness of approaching fall in the shade. I had woken up early. As usual, old habits die hard. Years in the service taught me to greet the day before the world stirred, and that routine stuck long after the uniform came off. I brewed a cup of strong black coffee, checked my perimeter cameras on the mounted tablet in the kitchen, and walked out into my modest garage to start the truck. It was a dark gray Ford F-150. Nothing flashy, but built like a tank. I kept it spotless and well-maintained, a kind of quiet discipline I brought with me from my years as a security specialist. The drive out of the neighborhood was supposed to be simple. Just a 10-minute cruise down Rosewood Trail to Route 91, where I'd head to a briefing in town, nothing formal, just coffee, with one of the governor's advance detail units. I still did part-time executive protection coordination, though these days, most of my work was done from behind a screen. I'd made it halfway down the main road of our neighborhood, Everpine Grove, when it happened. A man stepped out into the street right in front of my truck. I braked hard, tires chirping slightly against the asphalt, though I wasn't going more than 20 miles an hour. The man stood firm, palm extended like he was issuing a lawful command. I blinked, confused. He wasn't wearing a uniform. No badge. No cruiser. No flashing lights. Just a black tactical-style vest with white letters stitched across the front, HOA Enforcement. At first I thought it was a joke. Maybe one of those neighborhood watch guys getting a little too excited about speed limits. But as I rolled down the window, his tone removed all doubt. "You need to step out of the vehicle," he barked, one hand resting on the top of what looked like a radio clipped to his belt. "We have reason to believe you violated community transport regulations." "Excuse me?" I asked, one brow lifting. "You're operating a commercial-sized vehicle without prior HOA clearance. That's a Class B residential violation." I glanced at him carefully. Early 40s, clean-shaven, mirrored sunglasses, slight limp in his left leg. Nervous hands, but a puffed chest. Probably ex-military, or wished he were. But there was something off his posture, screamed bravado, not training. No backup, no authority. I kept my voice calm. "Are you a law enforcement officer? I'm with the HOA Enforcement Division. We operate under neighborhood jurisdiction and code authority." I let that hang in the air for a second, like the words themselves might make more sense if given time. "Is there such a division?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a clipboard and started writing something down. "You'll receive a fine in the mail. You're also being cited for excessive tint, non-standard lighting, and a visible GPS mount. Those are restricted under Section 7.2 of Vehicular Code for the community." That's when I saw the camcorder. Not a phone. An actual mounted camcorder, duct-taped to a small tripod and resting against his chest. He was recording me. I exhaled slowly. I didn't want to escalate. "Sir," I said evenly, "I have somewhere I need to be. If you believe I've violated some policy, I suggest you notify the HOA formally. Blocking traffic and impersonating enforcement, however, are a bit more serious." His jaw twitched. "You can file a complaint with these board," he said, stepping back. "For now, you're free to go, but don't think this is over." I gave a small nod and rolled forward slowly, watching him in the rearview mirror as he scribbled something on his clipboard with theatrical flair. He was enjoying himself far too much. When I turned the corner onto Alder Lane and left him behind, I felt a strange knot in my chest. Not anger, exactly. Something between confusion and disquiet. Was this normal? Were other homeowners being stopped like this? Was this actually sanctioned by the HOA? Or just one guy with delusions of authority? I didn't have answers. But I knew one thing for sure. This wouldn't be the last time I saw him. When I got to the coffee meeting with the governor's detail later that morning, I didn't mention it. I just listened, took notes, and kept my eyes on the broader mission. But in the back of my mind, that black vest and those fake citations kept replaying like a broken tape. I'd left behind war zones, international security threats, and covert operations to live in peace. My job now was to keep high-profile officials safe, not myself. But maybe that was about to change. Because if there's one thing I know about people who weaponize fake authority, it's this. They never stop with just one target. I didn't see him again for 2 days, not until Saturday morning just after sunrise. I'd gone out to rake the front yard, half for upkeep, half for peace of mind. The rhythm of it helped me think. With each pull of the rake, I tried to ground myself in the quiet of Everpine Grove, the chirping birds, the wind brushing through the oaks lining the sidewalk, the distant sound of a sprinkler system kicking on. It was supposed to be a good place. That's why I moved here after retiring. That's when I spotted him again. Same vest, same clipboard. This time he was walking down the sidewalk on Azalea Court like he owned the place. I watched from behind a trimmed hedge as he stopped in front of each house, scribbled notes, and occasionally squatted to examine things, mailboxes, lawn borders, even exterior light fixtures. At one point, he took photos of someone's backyard through the slats in their fence. I moved to the edge of my driveway as he approached. He saw me straightened and gave a smirk that was halfway between smug and condescending. "Mornin' neighbor," he said, flipping his clipboard to a new page. "You always wear that vest?" I asked, leaning casually on the rake. He patted it with pride. "Part of the job." "Which job is that exactly?" He shrugged. "Community code enforcement. Keeps the neighborhood clean." "Which department?" "Because I know city code enforcement." "You're not it." His eyes narrowed just a fraction. "We're private, HOA sanctioned. But we work in conjunction with local ordinances." "Really?" I let the word hang. "Because I checked the HOA handbook. There's no mention of an enforcement division, just volunteer committees." He took a step forward, chest puffed out. "Look, if you have an issue with me doing my job, you can take it up with the board." "I will." He pulled a folded document from a pouch on his belt and shoved it toward me. "Then you might want to start with this. Your truck is now flagged for ongoing investigation. Repeated offenses. We've received several complaints." I unfolded the page. It wasn't an official citation, just a poorly formatted printout with my address, a stock photo of my vehicle, and a list of supposed violations. There was no seal, no HOA letterhead, not even a real signature. I looked back up at Paul Remsen, holding the paper loosely between my fingers. "You're not real enforcement, and what you're doing, this is impersonation. That's a felony in this state." He didn't flinch. "Funny," he said, "coming from someone who drives a government-plated vehicle into a private neighborhood." "What exactly do you do?" Again, I didn't answer. Because the less they knew about me, the better for now. Instead, I tucked the paper under my arm and went back to raking. Not because I was backing down, but because I needed him to underestimate me. People like him overplay their hand when they think you're dismissible. He hovered a second longer before turning and walking away, making a show of jotting more notes on his clipboard. I waited until he was out of sight before pulling out my phone and opening a secure app. A few taps later, I was recording audio notes, tagging the location and logging the time. I described the encounter in detail. His outfit, his behavior, the fake citation. Just about me anymore. He was targeting other homes, invading privacy, harassing people under the guise of HOA authority. The next day, I canvassed Everpine Grove under the pretense of passing out seasonal HOA newsletters, something I knew the real committee wouldn't bother to do. I knocked on doors, asked subtle questions. Had anyone else been stopped, harassed? The responses ranged from annoyed sighs to concerned nods. Mrs. Evelyn Alder said he'd accused her of hoarding trash cans in the backyard. Ethan and Clara Brooks told me he stood outside their nursery window at night inspecting noise violations. Javier Alvarez even claimed his tires had been mysteriously slashed the same night he confronted the vest wearer. But no one had filed a formal complaint. He said he's with the HOA. Mrs. Evelyn Alder told me. I didn't want to cause trouble. That's what they were counting on, fear. Fear of rocking the boat, of retaliation, of community shame. But I wasn't afraid, because I'd seen what unchecked authority looked like overseas. I'd watched men abuse power behind veils of procedure and legitimacy. I'd buried friends because people were too afraid to speak up. Not here. Not on my street. That night, I reviewed all the security footage I'd pulled from my cameras. Sure enough, I caught Paul Remsen on the feed pausing near my truck, pointing at the front license plate, snapping photos. Another clip showed him bending near my mailbox with what looked like a small flashlight. I isolated the footage, trimmed it, watermarked it, and saved it to 2 separate encrypted drives. Then I did the same for the audio logs. I didn't know what he was planning yet, but I wasn't going to be caught off guard. The next morning, I called my friend, David Kessler, a city prosecutor I used to work with, when we coordinated joint protection units during emergencies. I kept the conversation light. Hypothetical question, I said. Shoot, David Kessler replied. If someone impersonated an officer, but under the name of a private HOA, and issued fake citations, would that be considered criminal impersonation? There was a pause. Yeah, he said slowly. If they presented themselves as having legal authority, wore insignia, handed out documents resembling citations, that's crossing a line. Why? No reason, I said. Just thinking about writing a letter to my neighborhood board. You do that, he said. And copy me if things get weird. They were already weird. What I didn't tell David Kessler was that I'd found something else, something darker. While scanning one of Everpine Grove's online forums, I noticed that Paul Remsen had been posting for months. Not as himself, but under multiple aliases, he'd been sowing paranoia, posting blurry night photos, claiming crime was rising, demanding tighter control, more surveillance, more enforcement presence. And people had believed him. That's why they'd let it happen. That's how he'd slithered into authority by creating a need, then filling it with himself. It wasn't just one man with a clipboard anymore. It was propaganda, manufactured panic, a soft coup. I closed my laptop, slowly sat in the dim kitchen, and watched the night settle across the lawn. I wasn't facing a neighbor with a superiority complex. I was facing a man who knew exactly what he was doing. And soon, he'd know exactly who he was doing it to. On Monday morning, I made my way to the HOA's main office, a squat beige building near the clubhouse, sandwiched between the tennis courts and a dry, dusty playground no one seemed to use. The sign out front read, Everpine Grove Homeowners Association, printed in an outdated font that tried hard to look authoritative. The windows were tinted, the bushes overgrown. It looked more like a DMV satellite office than a place for community engagement. I wore khakis, a polo, and a neutral expression. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and air freshener. A receptionist in her 60s sat behind a desk, too large for the room, flipping through a catalog. She looked up startled when the door chimed. Can I help you? She asked, polite but already half annoyed. I'd like to speak to someone about an enforcement matter, I said calmly. There was an incident on Azalea Court. A man in a vest, claiming to be with HOA enforcement, stopped me and issued fake citations. Her brow lifted. You mean Paul, that's his name. She hesitated. Yes, Paul Remsen volunteers with our compliance committee. He helps with property checks, resident reminders, that sort of thing. Is there an official enforcement division within the HOA? Another pause. Not formally. But we have community volunteers who report issues. Paul's just very enthusiastic. I nodded slowly. Is he authorized to stop vehicles, demand IDs? Photograph, private property. Oh, goodness, no! She said quickly, laughing in a way that was meant to be disarming. He's not a police officer. He's just trying to help. I took a breath. He stepped in front of my truck, refused to move, and threatened me with legal violations. He handed me an unsealed citation document and claimed my truck was under investigation. That's not just helping. The smile vanished. Well, if you feel it was inappropriate, I'm sure the board would be happy to address your concerns. We have an open forum at the next monthly meeting. That's in 3 weeks, correct? She nodded. Third Thursday. Residents can speak for up to 3 minutes. 3 minutes. That's all they gave the people they claim to serve. I left my name and a printed statement with her detailing the incident, including dates, times, and a list of witnesses. I didn't mention the security footage. Not yet. As I turned to go, I caught movement in the side office. A tall, thin man in a blazer stepped out into the hallway. His name tag read, Denise Whitmore, HOA President. The irony of the name struck me. Denise was a man late 50s, silver goatee, piercing eyes. He gave me a practiced politician smile and extended a hand. Mr. I shook it. Morgan, Jackson Morgan. Well, Mr. Morgan, welcome to Everpine Grove. I understand you've had a little run-in with our dear Paul Remsen. Run-in is one word for it. He chuckled as if we were two old friends swapping golf stories. Paul's a bit intense, but harmless. Keeps our streets looking tidy, keeps the residents on their toes. He's impersonating law enforcement. Denise Whitmore's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. That's a strong accusation. It's also true and illegal. There was a beat of silence before he replied. Look, he said, stepping closer. This neighborhood runs smoothly because people like Paul Remsen care enough to enforce the rules when others let things slide. We're not monsters, Mr. Morgan. We were just trying to preserve property values, uphold the bylaws. You understand that, don't you? I understand the law. I said, and I understand that this volunteer enforcer is violating several of them. He shrugged. You're free to file a complaint. I already did. And if this isn't addressed, I'll take it to the city. Now the mask slipped just a flicker. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. We like to handle things internally here. Keeps Everpine Grove looking clean, quiet, unified. The words weren't just words. They were a threat paper-thin and wrapped in community lingo. I believe in unity, I said, matching his tone. But I also believe in accountability. We held each other's gaze for a moment longer, then I turned and walked out. By the time I got home, the lawn sign I'd placed out front, Support Local Veterans, was missing. It had been there for 3 months. Coincidence? Maybe. But then the following day, a violation notice appeared on my door, improper lawn edge, unapproved gutter extension, commercial grade vehicle parked longer than permitted hours. They were retaliating. Paul Remsen's actions were being backed, or at least tolerated, by the HOA board. I suspected more than that. I suspected they'd given him quiet permission to do their dirty work, to intimidate, to control. I wasn't the only one. By now, neighbors were texting me quietly, cautiously. Margaret Hayes sent me a video of Paul Remsen standing on her porch demanding she lower the volume of a television he couldn't possibly have heard from the sidewalk. Another showed him shining a flashlight through the window of Noah Patel's parked car, claiming he had reason to suspect contraband. They weren't just embarrassed. They were afraid. And they had reason to be. Because the more I dug, the more I realized Paul Remsen wasn't acting alone. There were others, men and women, who had begun adopting the same vest, the same clipped speech patterns, the same smug air of authority. It was growing, a self-appointed force. And the HOA, they just smiled. At the next city council meeting, I brought it up carefully without naming names. I asked about private citizens issuing citations, about the legality of neighborhood enforcement volunteers. I saw the confusion on the council members' faces. They hadn't heard of it. They promised to look into it, but I knew it would take weeks. Bureaucracy moves slowly, so I started moving faster. I compiled every message, every photo, every piece of video. I created a shared folder and sent it to 3 places: the city prosecutor's office, a local investigative journalist I'd met at a security conference, Celia Tran, and a private civil rights attorney I knew from my DC days. And then I waited. A few days passed in silence, until one night, just before midnight, my front doorbell rang. I checked the camera. Paul Remsen. He stood in the porch light, arms crossed, vest zipped tight, clipboard tucked under one arm. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He looked into the camera, gave a tight smile, and whispered something I couldn't quite make out. But I recognized the look. It was the same look I'd seen in war zones, in unstable regions. The look of someone who thought they were untouchable. The next morning, I found a dead crow in my mailbox. Taped to its leg was a printout of my photo taken from the HOA's official newsletter. The word traitor was scrawled across it in red ink. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just neighborhood politics anymore. It was war. I didn't report the crow to the HOA. I didn't go storming back into their office or leave angry voicemails demanding action. That would have been playing right into their game. They wanted a reaction. They wanted to rattle me, but I'd seen worse. In Baghdad, we found tripwires buried under discarded children's shoes. In northern Jordan, I watched a man throw himself in front of a convoy to shield his village. People like Paul Remsen, people who dressed up in fake power and threatened retirees with citations, they didn't scare me. but they did need to be stopped. I took photos of the crow, the note, and the mailbox from every angle. Uploaded them into a secure server I kept offline, accessible only through a VPN and biometric ID. It was overkill for some. For me, it was Tuesday. I called in a favor to a friend I hadn't spoken to in years, Kirk Madden. We did joint protection work a decade ago, and now he ran a small but skilled digital forensics team that consulted for attorneys and state agencies. I didn't tell him everything, just the essentials. Kirk, I've got an HOA turned vigilante. Fake officers, intimidation, possibly stalking. He chuckled. You live in one of those neighborhoods, huh? Yeah, but this isn't just annoying. This feels organized. Send me what you've got, he said. I'll scrub it, see what bleeds through. I compiled a compressed folder, videos, screenshots of the Crow chat threads with neighbors' stills of Paul Remsen in his vest, copies of his phony citations, and a screen recording of his forum posts from the HOA message board. Within hours, Kirk Madden responded. Your guy's been posting from multiple dummy accounts, same IP. I traced it back to an address that's listed under a Shell Property Trust. That trust, it's tied to your HOA president, Denise Whitmore. That hit harder than I expected, even though I'd suspected something. Denise Whitmore wasn't just tolerating Paul Remsen, he was protecting him. Maybe even funding this little suburban militia. Suddenly, it all made sense, the sudden proliferation of enforcement vests, the matching clipboards, the coordinated property violations. It wasn't just Paul Remsen being overzealous. This was sanctioned coercion. I thanked Kirk Madden, wired him a consulting fee that was more like a donation, and moved to the next phase collection. I rigged 2 additional trail cams on my property, small, motion-triggered, infrared equipped. One covered the driveway, the other faced the mailbox. I even bought a fake rock with a hidden 4K lens and buried it beneath the hedge near my front porch. I wasn't trying to catch Paul Remsen in the act. I was preparing a case. Meanwhile, I increased my outreach to neighbors slowly and carefully. I didn't want to spook anyone. I left anonymous flyers in mailboxes. Have you been approached by fake HOA enforcement? You are not alone. Email homeowner justice@protonmail.com. The inbox filled faster than I expected. Lisa Carter said Paul Remsen had demanded the removal of a wheelchair-accessible ramp because it was unsightly. Margaret Hayes shared screenshots of text messages she'd received from an HOA number threatening legal action if she didn't remove wind chimes from her back porch. Ethan and Clara Brooks admitted they were fined $1,000 for failure to resod, even though their property was undergoing HOA-approved landscape repairs. They were extorting people. Through fear, through fake documentation, through silence. But silence was ending. I compiled a master spreadsheet. Each row was a case. Each column detailed the date, time, incident, witness, and whether or not video or documentation existed. By week's end, I had over 40 entries. Then the retaliation started ramping up. My trash bins were moved several blocks away and dumped over. My internet cut out randomly every other night until I discovered a small jammer buried in my backyard hedges. Once I found my garage door wide open at 3:00 a.m., even though the logs showed it had never been triggered by my remote. They were testing boundaries. What they didn't know was that I'd long since moved critical documents off-site. I had backups stored in a weatherproof lockbox 30 miles away, and cloud redundancies under alias accounts. If they thought they could erase my progress by intimidation, they had no idea who they were dealing with. But I needed more than evidence. I needed exposure. That's when I reached out to Celia Tran, an investigative journalist for a regional online news outlet. We met a few years ago when she embedded for a piece on VIP convoy protocol. She had guts, and she owed me a favor. Celia, I said, when we finally connected, you ever wanted to win a local journalism award? She laughed. What'd you get yourself into this time? A suburban dictatorship. HOA president. Fake cops. Real intimidation. And a community too afraid to speak. She grew quiet. You have proof I have a war chest. Within days, she drove down to Everpine Grove, and we met at the community park neutral ground open sightlines. I handed over 2 flash drives. She looked through them silently, her jaw tightening with each folder she opened. "This is bigger than local, it is. And you want me to go public? I want you to shine a light," I said. "Because these people only operate in the dark." She nodded slowly. "You know they'll come after you. They already have." 2 nights later, the article dropped. The HOA that went rogue, fake enforcement, and the war inside Everpine Grove. The piece was scathing. It detailed Paul Remsen's impersonation, quoted anonymous victims, included redacted images of forged violations and abusive messages, and subtly hinted at the involvement of Denise Whitmore. It went viral. Local outlets picked it up within hours. City officials released a statement calling for full investigation into the operations of private neighborhood enforcement groups. A state representative even tweeted that such actions would not be tolerated in any community receiving public services. Suddenly, the balance shifted. Neighbors started speaking more freely. Someone uploaded a full video of Paul Remsen harassing Isabel Torres and her daughter Ava Torres about unsanctioned sidewalk chalk. Isabel Torres had been too afraid to share it until now. HOA board members scrambled to release statements disavowing Paul Remsen, claiming he acted alone. But I wasn't done. Because the truth was, Paul Remsen had been appointed. The day after the article, I received an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a printout of the original board meeting minutes from 6 months ago. Handwritten notes in the margin circled a section titled Neighborhood Compliance Proposal. Under it, the words approved, PR to oversee implementation of Enforcement Subcommittee. PR Paul Remsen. Denise Whitmore had lied. The board had authorized the enforcement role, and they were covering it up. I photographed the document, traced its origin through the watermark on the paper. It had been printed in the HOA office. Someone on the inside had flipped. I didn't know who yet, but it meant I had a new weapon: whistleblowers. What Paul Remsen didn't realize, what Denise Whitmore couldn't possibly predict, was that their own people were starting to question the operation. And once the cracks appeared, the entire facade would fall. The war wasn't over, but I could already smell the smoke from their crumbling empire. The fire started in Margaret Hayes' compost bin. I didn't even know she had one until the smoke started curling above the fence line around 4:00 a.m. The security system tripped, sending a quiet buzz to my phone. I was already awake, running surveillance logs from the previous day. I watched in real time as a shadow darted across my lawn. Then a flicker of orange appeared near the fence, separating my property from hers. By the time I reached the back porch, hose in hand, the flames were climbing 3 feet high. The air reeked of accelerant. Luckily, it didn't spread, just scorched the bin and blackened a piece of siding. The fire department arrived fast, and the chief was someone I knew from my time consulting with the Governor's Emergency Services Task Force. He took one look at the scene and nodded grimly. "Someone did this on purpose," he said, crouching by the melted plastic. "I know," I replied. Officially, it was recorded as suspicious, but I knew better. It was targeted, strategic. Just far enough from my property not to seem personal, but close enough to send a message. They were escalating. The day after Celia Tran's article dropped, HOA board members started circling their wagons. The newsletter went out with a thinly veiled rebuttal calling recent media coverage inflammatory and rooted in misinformation from a small group of disgruntled residents. They didn't name me directly. They didn't have to. People knew. And suddenly, I became the dividing line. Some neighbors started crossing the street when they saw me walking. Others slowed their cars, nodded, whispered thanks. At night, someone left a pie on my doorstep. The next morning, someone else threw eggs at my truck. Retaliation and admiration. Two faces of the same coin. Paul Remsen, of course, vanished. No more vest patrols. No more sidewalk confrontations. But his absence didn't bring relief. It brought anxiety. He'd gone underground. That made him more dangerous. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a notification from one of the trail cams. Motion detected 1:37 a.m. I pulled up the feed. The figure was blurry but familiar. Denim jacket, ball cap, broad shoulders. He was kneeling at the base of my mailbox. When I checked in the morning, the box had been pried open. The hinges warped. Nothing was stolen, but a single item had been added. A toy sheriff's badge. Cheap plastic, gold, and scratched. Placed deliberately in the center like a calling card. They weren't trying to stay hidden anymore. They wanted me to know they were watching. I took it all to David Kessler, the prosecutor friend. We met in a nondescript diner halfway between the city and Everpine Grove. I brought everything printed stills, timelines, video files on a secure drive. He flipped through the material silent-focused. Jesus, he muttered. They're bold. Bold or stupid, I said. He leaned back in his booth. Probably both. But the intimidation, the arson, the mailbox tampering, that's federal. I nodded. That's why I'm here. He sighed. You're going to have to testify eventually. You realize that. I've faced worse. I know you have. But suburban politics, it's a different battlefield. People don't fight fair out here. No uniforms, no rules. I don't need rules, I said. I need leverage. He smiled faintly. You've got it. The next step was quiet but powerful. David Kessler pulled a few strings and had a city investigator reach out to the HOA for a routine inquiry. The board wasn't charged, not yet. But the pressure was mounting, and people in positions of comfort panic when the walls start to move. Sure enough, within a week, 2 of the lesser board members resigned suddenly, citing personal reasons. Rumor had it one of them received a subpoena. The other, I later found out she was the one who left that anonymous envelope with the meeting minutes in my mailbox. Her silence had been broken. The crack had widened. Still, Denise Whitmore remained untouchable, or so he thought. He doubled down, held a special meeting where he addressed the smear campaign, rallied his loyalists, and even announced a new initiative, Neighborhood Security Stewards. It was the same play, just renamed. They handed out bright yellow sashes instead of vests. Clipboards now bore the HOA logo. The language changed, but the goal remained intimidation under the banner of community standards. But this time, I was ready. I attended that meeting not as a participant, but as an observer. Sat in the back row, arms folded, recording everything. Denise Whitmore looked at me once mid-speech. His smile faltered for a split second. He knew. After the meeting, I stepped outside where Samantha Nguyen was directing traffic. She looked to be in her 20s, nervous, gripping the clipboard like it had weight. I approached gently. You volunteering? She nodded. Mr. Whitmore said it was a great way to meet people. Did he tell you you'd be issuing warnings to veterans and stalking teenagers? She froze. I'm not accusing you, I said, softening. But you should know what you're aligning with. I handed her a card, just an email address. No name, no title. Later that week, I received a message from her. She quit the next day. The tide was shifting. But Paul Remsen wasn't done. Late one night, my power cut out. Just mine. I knew immediately it wasn't an accident. I walked the property line with a flashlight, careful, deliberate. Found the panel near the side gate open. The switch flipped. Lock cut. I replaced the lock. Filed a police report. But that night I didn't sleep. Because now they were willing to tamper with infrastructure. What was next, I called Celia Tran. They're pushing, I told her. Trying to provoke me. Trying to make me overstep. They want you to lash out, she said, so they can discredit you. I was silent for a moment. Then, time to go public. She hesitated. More public, I want a press conference, a formal one, in front of City Hall, with me on record. That'll bring attention. Real attention. That's the point. A week later, I stood in front of the marble steps of City Hall. Cameras clicked. Microphones stretched forward like hungry mouths. The mayor stood beside me. David Kessler was behind me. Celia Tran was live streaming the whole thing. I read from a prepared statement. I told the public what had happened. The fake citations, the impersonation, the fire, the threats, the systemic abuse of power hiding under the name of a neighborhood association. I didn't name Paul Remsen. I named Denise Whitmore. I named the votes, the documents, the structure of fear. I ended with one line. This was never about grass length or mailbox colors. This was about control, and it ends now. The fallout was immediate. The HOA's inbox crashed from the volume of complaints. 3 board members resigned within 24 hours. Denise Whitmore released a statement calling the claim slanderous, but no one bought it. Because now the city was watching. And behind them, the state. And Paul Remsen had gone silent. But I knew we hadn't heard the last from him. Not yet. It happened 2 days after the press conference. I was making breakfast steel-cut oats, a couple of soft-boiled eggs, black coffee, same routine I'd kept since my deployment days, when I saw the cruiser pull up outside my house. At first, I didn't think much of it. Everpine Grove wasn't the kind of neighborhood where police came often, but the world was watching now. Maybe it was a courtesy follow-up. Maybe someone was checking in. Then a second cruiser rolled up. Then a third. I stood at the window, mug in hand, unmoving. I could see 2 officers stepping out of the lead car. One had a notepad. The other rested his palm lightly on his belt. Not on the firearm, but close enough. I placed my coffee down gently. By the time the knock came, I'd already reviewed my camera feeds, nothing out of the ordinary. The trail cams were untouched. My firewall hadn't logged any remote intrusions. I'd been quiet, controlled. I hadn't retaliated. I hadn't provoked. I opened the door. The officer in front, a tall man with tired eyes, introduced himself. Detective Michael Sanders. This is Officer Elena Marquez. May we come in? Am I being detained? I asked calmly. No, sir. But we'd like to speak with you about a report that was filed early this morning. I stepped aside and gestured toward the front room. Come in. You can sit there. They did, but they didn't relax. They perched on the edge of the couch like they expected the floor to give out beneath them. I stayed standing. What's the report? I asked. Detective Michael Sanders looked at his notes as if double-checking that what he was about to say wouldn't sound ridiculous. We received an anonymous tip alleging that you had made violent threats toward members of your HOA board, specifically Denise Whitmore and Paul Remsen. I blinked. That's false. He nodded. We're not saying it's true, Mr. Morgan. But when someone claims a former military officer, especially one with a security background, has issued threats, we're obligated to follow up. What exactly did the report claim? He hesitated. That you said, and I quote, I have the skills to end this quickly if I need to. I scoffed. That sounds like something out of a bad action movie. That's what we thought too. Do you have a copy of the recording? A witness, no audio. Just a typed transcript. The tip was submitted through a third-party reporting app. The sender used a proxy. We're trying to trace it, but it'll take time. Was it from Paul Remsen? We don't know. But I knew. And so did they. Paul Remsen was cornered. He'd tried fear. He'd tried sabotage. Now he was trying the nuclear option to paint me as unstable. Dangerous. A threat. I walked to my hallway closet, unlocked the small biometric safe, and pulled out a folder labeled Contingencies. Inside was everything: emails, screenshots, chat logs, a signed affidavit from Ethan Brooks, who'd overheard Paul Remsen bragging about scaring that ex-soldier off his lawn. I placed the folder on the table. Gentlemen, I said, what you're holding is the beginning of a conspiracy to obstruct justice. You'll also find evidence that your tipster has previously tampered with my mail, cut my power, and possibly committed arson. Officer Elena Marquez flipped through the pages, her expression tightening with each one. Detective Michael Sanders exhaled slowly. You documented all of this. I'm chief of security for the governor, I said. This is me going easy. They left 20 minutes later, not only satisfied I wasn't a threat, but concerned they just stepped into a hornet's nest bigger than they'd expected. I didn't stop there. I sent a courtesy message to the governor's office. Just a short update, professional tone. Potential attempt to discredit me through false law enforcement contact. No immediate threat, but increasing in frequency. Will advise. I got a response in 20 minutes. Understood. Keep records. You have our backing. Stay sharp. Those 5 words, you have our backing, were all I needed. Because the next move was mine. That night, I met with Celia Tran again, this time not as a source, but as a subject. She wanted to write a second article, deeper, darker. One that exposed the weaponization of law enforcement through false reporting. I want to publish your full title, she said, her pen hovering above the notepad. Not just retired security specialist. I want people to know who you really are. I hesitated, then nodded. Do it. The next morning, the headline hit every screen in the region: governor's chief of security, targeted by fake HOA cop and board president in growing Everpine Grove scandal. This time, it wasn't just local coverage. State news picked it up, then national aggregators. Suddenly, HOA abuse was a trending topic. Thousands of people from across the country were flooding forums, sharing horror stories calling for reform. The Everpine Grove HOA had gone from shadow rulers to the punchline of an American overreach joke. But Denise Whitmore didn't take it lying down. He issued a formal cease and desist letter addressed to me, Celia Tran, and the governor's office. It accused us of defamation, demanded retractions, threatened lawsuits. I read it twice, then forwarded it to the state attorney general's office. Celia Tran published the letter verbatim. People laughed. But beneath the surface, the pressure was boiling. More board members resigned. Paul Remsen was spotted once leaving a storage unit outside the city limits, and then finally the subpoenas came. One for Denise Whitmore, one for Paul Remsen. 2 others followed, sealed and unnamed. The city had officially opened a case for criminal impersonation harassment and conspiracy to violate civil rights. And still they fought. They filed an emergency petition to dissolve the HOA temporarily to avoid further liability. Claimed the organization was under attack by outside forces, asked for immunity. Judge Brenda Caffrey denied it and set a hearing, a public one, where I would testify. I spent the next few days preparing. I rewatched the videos, reorganized every piece of evidence, ironed the shirt I planned to wear, polished my shoes like it was the first day of deployment, because this wasn't about me anymore. It was about principle, about every quiet homeowner who had ever been bullied into silence, about every fake badge, every false rule, every whispered threat behind a clipboard. They thought they could use the system to control people, but the system was finally waking up, and I was going to help make sure it saw everything clearly. The courthouse wasn't imposing, not like the marble behemoths in D.C. or the fortresses I'd walked through overseas. It was modest 3 stories of limestone and brick, with ivy crawling up one side and a small veterans memorial tucked into the front lawn. I stood beside it that morning, taking a breath. The names on the plaque reminded me why I was doing this, not just for me, for the people who couldn't. Inside the courtroom was already packed. The hearing had drawn attention. Journalists, residents from across the county, a few distant homeowners who had flown in after reading the articles. There was even a camera crew posted up outside, interviewing folks as they filed in. Judge Brenda Caffrey was no nonsense. Late 50s, sharp eyes, former military prosecutor. I liked her already. Paul Remsen wasn't there. But Denise Whitmore was. He sat at the far end of the defendant's table, flanked by 2 lawyers dressed in a navy suit and red tie, like he was still in campaign mode. His expression was tight jaw flexing every few minutes, like he couldn't quite believe this was happening to him. When the clerk called my name, the room shifted. I walked to the front and stood behind the witness stand. The bailiff administered the oath. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God, I do. Then I looked up at Judge Brenda Caffrey and nodded once. My name is Jackson Morgan. I'm a retired Army intelligence officer with 22 years of service. Currently, I serve as the Chief of Security for the governor of this state. That was the moment everything shifted. Gasps, murmurs. I could feel the shock radiating off Denise Whitmore and his counsel. I didn't pause. I continued, voice steady. For the past several months, I have been the target of harassment, intimidation, and surveillance by Paul Remsen, acting under the false pretense of HOA enforcement. This role does not exist in any official legal capacity. His actions were not only unsupported by state law, they were actively encouraged by this HOA's leadership, specifically Denise Whitmore. I laid it out piece by piece, the stop in the road, the fake citation, the stalking, the threats, the tampering, the arson attempt. I showed footage, submitted logs, emails, cell records, time-stamped photos, the crow, the badge, the mailbox, and I gave them motive. Power, control, profit. The HOA board used fear to control Everpine Grove, to silence opposition, to rewrite what community meant. I turned to face the courtroom. Let me be clear. I did not move here to make trouble. I moved here to be part of something decent, to rest, to heal. And I was met with aggression wrapped in policy abuse disguised as regulation. Judge Brenda Caffrey leaned forward slightly. Mr. Morgan, were you at any time acting under official capacity as a member of the governor's office during this conflict? No, Your Honor. I acted only as a private citizen, but I brought with me the same principles that govern my service order respect and justice. Denise Whitmore's attorney objected, claimed emotional manipulation. Judge Brenda Caffrey overruled him. They tried to poke holes in my testimony, asked why I didn't report earlier, why I didn't call 911 when I was first stopped. I explained it all. Calm, clear, no anger, just facts. Because I didn't need to win the room. I already had. Celia Tran was seated in the second row scribbling rapidly. Behind her neighbors, I hadn't spoken to in months, sat together, some nodding, some teary-eyed, some just stunned. Javier Alvarez raised a hand in a quiet salute. When my testimony ended, the prosecution called additional witnesses. Lisa Carter took the stand and, despite her shaking hands, told the court how Paul Remsen had threatened to report her for excessive noise after her son's oxygen machine ran overnight. Isabel Torres testified that her autistic son, Ava Torres's brother, had been reduced to tears when Paul Remsen yelled at him for loitering outside his own house. Ethan and Clara Brooks spoke about their dog being reported to animal control for barking when they didn't even own a dog. Each story chipped away at the defendant's defense. Each voice filled in the outline of the truth. Finally, Judge Brenda Caffrey recessed for deliberation. No one moved. We all waited. And when she returned 30 minutes later, the silence was electric. In light of the testimonies presented, the evidence submitted, and the pattern of behavior made clear to this court, I am ordering an immediate injunction against all HOA-sanctioned enforcement actions. Paul Remsen will be served with a warrant for impersonation of a law enforcement officer and conspiracy to harass. Denise Whitmore, this board is hereby placed under state review. Denise Whitmore stood up maybe to protest, but the bailiff moved before he could speak. He sat down fast. Then Judge Brenda Caffrey looked directly at me. Mr. Morgan, thank you for your service, both in uniform and here. The gavel dropped. It was done. I walked out of that courthouse into a sea of flashing cameras and open mics. Celia Tran stood off to the side, smiling. You sure you don't want to comment? She asked. I shook my head. Let the facts speak for themselves. At home, I sat on the porch, listening to the wind. No fake citations, no dead animals, no severed wires, just quiet. 2 days later, I received a note in the mail. No return address, no threats. Just a single sentence written in block letters, I was wrong. Thank you. It was unsigned. But I recognized the handwriting. Paul Remsen. Maybe justice hadn't reached him yet. But something else had. Remorse. Or fear. Or maybe respect. For 3 days after the hearing, Everpine Grove existed in an eerie calm like a battlefield just after the ceasefire. No more vests. No more yellow sashes. The HOA office sat shuttered, its windows dark. The compliance hotline that used to ring off the hook now gave a dead dial tone. The silence was not peace. It was the vacuum left behind after a toppled regime. And yet, it didn't feel like victory. Not yet. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Paul Remsen to reemerge, for Denise Whitmore to try some legal sleight of hand, for someone in the shadows to whisper about restoring order. But nothing came. Just birdsong, sprinklers, the quiet hum of life trying to return to normal. It didn't last. On the morning of the fourth day, my phone rang. Unknown number. Government prefix. Mr. Morgan, said the voice on the other end. This is Special Agent Lauren Reed with the Department of Justice. We're conducting an active investigation into multiple complaints of civil rights violations associated with homeowners associations across the state. I sat up straight. You're aware of the Everpine Grove case. More than aware, she said. We'd like to speak with you in person. Within 48 hours, I found myself in a small conference room inside the federal building downtown. Plain table, plain walls. 2 agents, 2 recorders, and a stack of files nearly 6 inches high. They didn't just want testimony. They wanted everything. The case had expanded. Celia Tran's second article had sparked a flood of similar complaints, neighborhoods with unchecked HOA boards, fraudulent fines forged, enforcement citations, and in several cases, physical confrontations. Everpine Grove had become the epicenter. The DOJ had been waiting for a case strong enough to justify an inquiry. We had given it to them. I spent 3 hours giving my full account under oath on the record. I submitted all my files, all the footage, all the community testimony. Special Agent Lauren Reed and Agent Sarah Mathers listened quietly, rarely interrupting, taking notes at a rapid pace. When I finished, Agent Sarah Mathers closed her folder and looked me in the eye. "You did more than stop a neighborhood bully, Mr. Morgan. You exposed a statewide pattern of abuse." I didn't say anything. Because I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because people had been silenced. And silence is the first step towards surrender. That same week, Paul Remsen was picked up by federal marshals. He didn't go quietly. According to the arrest record, he barricaded himself inside a storage unit he'd been renting outside of city jurisdiction. Inside, they found evidence bags labeled with resident names, a burner phone surveillance logs, and several counterfeit HOA documents bearing forged city seals. He'd gone full rogue. The charge is impersonation of a law enforcement officer, interstate harassment, wire fraud, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. It was no longer a local issue. It was federal. Denise Whitmore, for his part, attempted to retreat into silence. He released no statement, no interview. But sources close to the board leaked documents proving he'd used HOA funds to reimburse Paul Remsen for equipment and uniforms, and had signed off on the creation of the so-called Neighborhood Enforcement Subcommittee. He'd buried himself. The state filed charges of misuse of funds, negligence, and aiding in the unlawful impersonation of authority. It would take time, but he was going down too. Back in Everpine Grove, things began to shift, slowly. The state appointed a temporary oversight committee to replace the HOA board. Instead of volunteers with vendettas, the new group consisted of civil mediators, urban planners, and most critically, actual residents who had remained neutral during the conflict. Rules were reviewed, fines suspended. All pending citations issued under Paul Remsen's watch were voided and expunged. And then the unexpected happened. People started coming forward not to complain, but to ask how they could help. They wanted to rebuild, not just the bylaws, but the community itself. Mrs. Evelyn Alder started hosting monthly porch potlucks. Noah Patel began volunteering to mow lawns for elderly neighbors. Samantha Nguyen joined the city's neighborhood outreach program. Something had shifted. Fear had made way for participation. Control had given way to connection. And yet, I kept my guard up. The trauma of surveillance doesn't fade overnight. I still walk the perimeter at night, still check my cams, still listen for tires slowing outside my driveway a little too long. But there was one moment that reminded me of why it had all been worth it. I was at the community park walking with a cup of coffee as the sun came up. Ava Torres was drawing with chalk on the sidewalk. A rainbow, a house stick, figures with smiling faces. Isabel Torres stood nearby watching me. We made eye contact. I expected her to tense, to glance away, to take Ava Torres's hand and leave. Instead, she smiled, genuine, and mouthed the words, "Thank you." That night, I received an email from Celia Tran. The title of her newest feature, From HOA Tyranny to Neighborhood Redemption, The Story of Jackson Morgan. I almost deleted it, not out of pride, but because I never wanted this to be about me. Then I saw the final sentence. What one man started with a quiet refusal to be bullied has now inspired legislation under review that could change how HOAs operate statewide. I stared at the screen for a long time, not smiling, not crying, just breathing. The war was over. But the watch continued. Because people like Paul Remsen don't disappear forever. They change names, move zip codes, start again. But so do people like me. Quiet protectors. Fence walkers, those who know that freedom doesn't start at borders or ballots. It starts with saying, no more. The trial of Paul Remsen and Denise Whitmore was set for a crisp Monday morning in early November. The leaves outside the courthouse had begun to brown and fall in uneven patches, littering the marble steps like forgotten warnings. I arrived early not because I had to, but because I wanted to feel the weight of the place before it was filled with noise. There was a peculiar stillness to the building. Inside, you could almost hear justice stretching its limbs, preparing to rise from sleep. This wasn't my hearing. I was no longer the target, nor the one pushing the action. I was a witness now, a part of the narrative, but no longer steering it. And that felt strange. A year ago, I was just another homeowner, a man seeking rest after decades in the shadows of national security. I'd wanted a backyard, a mailbox I didn't have to reinforce, the kind of quiet that doesn't require a contingency plan. Now I was preparing to testify in a case that had captured national attention, where the defendants weren't just a fake cop and a power-hungry HOA president, but symbols of a broken system. A cautionary tale in motion. The courtroom filled quickly. Journalists, neighbors, representatives from state offices, even a couple of legislators I recognized from Capitol briefings, had slipped in through the side doors, their aides whispering at their sides. Denise Whitmore entered first. His posture was different now, no longer the smooth operator, but a man carrying a weight he couldn't charm his way out of. He looked thinner. His suit hung looser than it had at the hearing weeks prior. His eyes were sunken. Still, he tried to flash a smile, nodding to familiar faces in the gallery. It didn't land. Paul Remsen followed 15 minutes later. He was flanked by 2 federal marshals. No vest, no sunglasses, no clipboard, just a gray jumpsuit and the look of someone who'd finally realized the fantasy was over. He didn't look at the gallery, didn't search for support. I was seated directly behind the prosecution table when his eyes finally found mine. He froze. I didn't blink, because I wanted him to know deep in whatever corner of himself he'd been hiding that I wasn't afraid. Not of him. Not of what he represented. Not anymore. Judge Thomas Rourke called the court to order. His voice was firm, his gaze sweeping across the room like a silent threat to anyone tempted to disrupt. Assistant U.S. Attorney Diane Wallace began with her opening statement. She laid it out clearly, a pattern of systemic abuse, falsified authority, organized harassment, and targeted retaliation. She outlined how Paul Remsen had operated as a pseudo-law enforcement figure without any jurisdiction and under the blessing, whether explicitly or through willful negligence, of HOA leadership. Then came the evidence. They played the videos I had submitted Paul Remsen stopping my truck, standing on porches issuing fake citations, harassing Noah Patel, photographing windows. They called witnesses more than I expected, Mrs. Evelyn Alder took the stand and, despite her shaking hands, told the court how Paul Remsen had threatened to report her for excessive noise after her husband's oxygen machine ran overnight. Isabel Torres testified that her autistic son had been reduced to tears when Paul Remsen yelled at him for loitering outside his own house. Ethan and Clara Brooks spoke about their dog being reported to animal control for barking when they didn't even own a dog. Each story chipped away at the defendant's defense. Each voice filled in the outline of the truth. And then it was my turn. I took the stand, swore the oath again, and spoke. Not with fire, not with drama, but with precision. I told them about the false stop, about the fake citations, about the mailbox tampering the power outages, the surveillance. I told them about the fear, the way neighbors stopped talking to each other, how children stopped playing on sidewalks, how the sense of community was replaced by quiet dread. And I told them the moment it turned. The day I decided I would no longer let my experience in covert protection mean silence. That protecting others sometimes meant standing in front of them, even without a shield. Paul Remsen's lawyer tried to trip me up, asked if I had ever threatened Paul Remsen, ever used my title to intimidate. No, I said, but I didn't need to, because the truth was louder than anything I could say. The courtroom held its breath. Later that afternoon, the defense rested. No one from Paul Remsen's side took the stand. Denise Whitmore tried. He insisted that he had no idea Paul Remsen's actions had gone that far. Claimed he was just trying to enforce the standards of Everpine Grove. That Paul Remsen had acted alone. That the board had been misled. But Assistant U.S. Attorney Diane Wallace pulled up the meeting minutes, the receipts, the reimbursement logs for uniform expenses. The emails where Denise Whitmore referred to Paul Remsen as our boots on the ground. The lie collapsed. The verdict came 2 days later. Paul Remsen guilty on all counts. Impersonation harassment, conspiracy, wire fraud, and unlawful surveillance. The sentencing would follow, but the conviction alone was thunderous. Denise Whitmore guilty on conspiracy to violate civil rights and misappropriation of HOA funds. The courtroom was silent as the verdicts were read. No cheers, no outbursts, just release. Like an exhale that had waited too long. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Microphones shoved forward. Questions flew. I gave one statement. Authority should protect, not prey. Today we remembered that. Then I walked away. No press tour. No book deal. No campaign launch like some suggested. I went home. To my porch. To the silence I'd fought so hard to reclaim. And that night, for the first time in nearly a year, I slept with the doors unlocked. Not because I was naive, but because I believed in what we'd rebuilt. Fall melted into winter without fanfare. Everpine Grove, once a powder keg of suspicion and tension, settled into something new. Not quite peace, but something approaching it. The tension that used to linger in every HOA meeting notice, every community email subject line, was gone. The air felt lighter. The sidewalks no longer whispered secrets. The HOA board, once the untouchable ruling class of our little neighborhood empire, had been officially dissolved. In its place, a community council was formed, structured around actual transparency, accountability, and rotating leadership. No more lifetime presidencies, no more hidden subcommittees. I didn't run for a seat. They asked me to. Politely, earnestly. I said no because my job wasn't to govern. It was to restore the chance for others to do it right. I helped train the first wave of council volunteers, showed them how to draft fair policy, how to implement community-wide voting tools. I brought in an old contact from city planning to help set up conflict resolution workshops. We had no more need for enforcers. What we needed was conversation. People began talking again. Mrs. Evelyn Alder hosted a potluck that brought out more neighbors than Halloween had in years. Ethan and Clara Brooks adopted a rescue dog and proudly walked it down the center sidewalk. Noah Patel helped repaint the community benches with the City Youth Council. Healing didn't come in grand moments, it came in small ones. The chalk drawings returned to the sidewalks, colorful, messy, unapologetic. Mailboxes stopped being fortresses and became perches for birds again. For a long while, I kept my cameras up. I reviewed footage every week, eyes trained for familiar silhouettes or old tactics revived. But eventually, I stopped checking so often. And one day, without realizing it, I let the battery in the mailbox cam die. No part of me rushed to replace it, because trust had started to bloom again, quietly, persistently. Even the community park felt different. The same place where Paul Remsen once berated families for unauthorized gatherings now held Saturday craft fairs and Friday night movie screenings. I stood back at one of them, watching a crowd of neighbors laugh in lawn chairs, passing popcorn down rows like communion. No one noticed me standing off to the side. That was the point. Everpine Grove had shifted from a place governed by fear to one held together by connection. Celia Tran's final follow-up article closed the trilogy. It was titled, "The Man Who Chose Peace Over Power: How One Homeowner Helped Rebuild His Community After Exposing Corruption." She sent me an advance copy. I didn't read it for a few days. When I did, I found myself stuck on one paragraph near the end. He never asked to lead, never demanded credit, and never raised his voice. Instead, Jackson Morgan offered his neighbors something rarer than victory dignity. He gave them the blueprint to stand on their own. I didn't think I deserved that. But it reminded me why I did what I did. I never set out to become a story. I just didn't want to be afraid in my own home. That would have been enough. And yet, as I sat on my porch that winter, coffee in hand, boots resting against the edge of the steps, I realized that something bigger had happened because people had risen to meet the truth. They'd spoken, they'd acted, and in doing so, they had reclaimed Everpine Grove. Then one last thing happened. An envelope came in the mail. No stamps, no address, just my name written in black ink. Inside a folded letter. Mr. Morgan, you don't know me. I used to work for another HOA in a different part of the state. I read your story. I watched the trial. And for the first time I left the job, I saw what we'd become. I'm not proud of what I did. But because of you, I'm trying to do better. Thank you. That was it. No name, no signature. Just change rippling outward. Quiet, personal, real. And that was all I ever wanted. Not revenge, not applause. Just one person standing up where they once sat down. One neighbor speaking out where they once stayed silent. One girl drawing on the sidewalk again. One man sitting in peace, watching the sun rise over a street that finally felt like home.